Right. Welcome to Program Instruction Module 3. This upcoming week, we're going to be talking about some behavior analytic conceptualizations. So prior to radical behaviorism, or around the time that radical behaviorism came into being, some popular causes of behavior were still being studied, right? So behavior was being studied. Behavior has been studied since the dawn of time. And here were some of the popular causes of behavior. So any conspicuous event which coincides with human behavior, behavior was explained in terms of the structure of the individual. So with conspicuous events, we're talking about like astrology predictions and numerology predictions, and pointing to events that are not necessarily observable or measurable, but were cited as causes for which human beings engaged in certain actions. Explaining behavior in terms of the structure of the individual. Examples can look like phrases that are pretty common even today, like the jovial fat man, or someone that's lean and mean, things like that. So attributing the cause of behavior to how an individual is perceived. Genetics and heredity, of course, were also popular causes, continue to be popular causes even today, as to like predispositions of how a person may end up behaving. And of course, inner causes at the neural, psychic, and conceptual level of human behavior. So your neurology dictates your behavior, your biology dictates your behavior, your mind dictates your behavior, and things like that. So this is kind of where the analysis of behavior began in traditional psychology. So some of the major issues with popular causes, as we've been discussing so far, is that one, they are mentalistic in that they attribute the cause of a behavior or the reason why a behavior occurred to something that's on a different dimension than the behavior itself. Circular reasoning, of course, we've talked about like causes and behavior sort of having this interlocking causal model of like, I ate because I'm hungry because I ate, or I'm angry. I hit him because I was angry because I hit him. And of course, correlational models, right? So a lot of it attributed it to like covariance of events that are not necessarily related to one another. And these are some of the sort of major issues that we are seeing, we continue to see with the popular causes of behavior. So why do organisms behave, right? So when we talk about cause and effect, and we pull from sort of traditional 19th century physics and things like that, within radical behaviorism, we sort of we revised, not manipulated, we revised our understanding of the occurrence of behavior. So instead of talking about in a traditional linear time causation model, Skinner started talking about behavior in terms of a change in an independent variable leading to a change in a dependent variable. So not necessarily that one, when we're thinking about cause and effect, not necessarily thinking about like this happened and therefore this happened. So much so that a change, instead talking in terms of this change occurred when these environmental variables were shifted. And as a result, we also started talking about behavior in terms of functional relations. So the occurrence of different events in certain orders that could be observed, measured, and could be seen sort of systematically repeat when those when those independent and dependent variables were arranged similarly at different times. So psychology, of course, continues to search for the cause. And the reason we do that is because searching for a cause is required to conduct a scientific analysis of behavior. So in order to describe, predict, and control behavior, we need to have information about the contingencies that are maintaining a behavior. However, what is cool about behavior analysis is that we shifted from, or radical behaviorism, is that we shifted from observing or locking in on the form of a behavior to the function of a behavior. So the variables of which behavior is a function is what interests us, because that is the sort of relation that is both observable, measurable, and replicable. Of course, this leads us to a functional analysis, which is which basically asks the question: how is a behavior functionally related to environmental events? Skinner called this a covariation of observables in a system. So while we sort of colloquially talk about cause and effect, we still need to remember that what we're actually how we're understanding behavior as radical behaviorists or behavior analysts is in this covariation of observables, right? Like, what is the function of a behavior in relation to its particular context? So Skinner was basically attempting to redefine the component terms of the language. So to change the function of the terms cause and effect by talking about covariations in the dependent variable as a result of variations in the independent variable. And he was attempting to sort of do this redefinition in order to diminish rigid causal notions. So in order to sort of like back away from like linear causality, or not to succumb to the fallacy, well, not fallacies, but like the drawbacks of linear causality, because like we talked about last week, behavior is under the function of its environment or context, and that context can also involve the learning history of the organism, right? Which does not necessarily fall within the sort of notions of rigid causality, because we're talking about different moments in time. So we briefly talked last week about emotions and thoughts and feelings, right? So of course, as you know, radical behaviorism promotes that thoughts and thinking and feeling is therefore behavior. And when we talk about emotions being behavior, we need to be able to operationally define them, right? So again, when we think about this sort of observing the function versus form, instead of honing in on what a behavior looks like, we look at how a behavior functions. So that's where we get our operational definition for the various experiences of human emotion. So we look at it in terms of whether something is functioning aversively or in a reinforcing, if the context is reinforcing or punishing, or reinforcing or aversive for a specific type of responding. Some of these responses can be conditioned, and some of these can be unconditioned responding, right? So like we've talked about previously with like trauma responses and things like that, we see that unconditioned responding of flight and fight are transferred, the functions of those get transferred to conditioned responses under the paradigm of operant and respondent learning. This is sort of also where in the chapter you'll see Skinner talk about traits and the dangers of like analyzing the traits of an organism, because traits are not behavior. We can't point to a behavior when we're talking about traits. And if we start talking about traits, we are likely once again going to fall in the trap of mentalistic a mentalistic analysis, because then traits quickly devolve into like inner causes, and then we're back again with the same conundrum. So we need to continue to keep, when we talk about things like emotions and anxiety and things like that, we still need to continue to be, we need to be shifting how we talk about them. So instead of talking about them as emotions, we talk about them as like, what are those feelings? Like find the responding, then that you're able to operationally define it, because there's observable and measurable components, and you can sort of analyze the function as being reinforcing or aversive. One of the chapters you'll also be reading this week is about punishment, right? So we have an understanding that punishment is not in behavior analysis quite the same as what we colloquially consider punishment, because colloquially when we talk about punishment, we're focusing on form, and in behavior analysis, we're once again focusing on punishing contingencies. So punishment is not the opposite of a reward. Punishment is a systematic manipulation as a result of either generating aversive contingencies for a specific behavior, such that that behavior is less likely to occur in future, in a similar context, and also, or like diminishing the reinforcement that's available, right? So we have to remember to define punishment functionally, because again, if we continue to fall in the trap of topography as opposed to function, it's really difficult to analyze repertoires in that manner, and B, we're really limiting ourselves in understanding repertoires, because what function as aversive contingencies for a human or reinforcing contingencies for a human are really broad in the way that they present themselves, and can they're really broad. So like tapping in on topography doesn't necessarily tell us how it's functioning in a context, and also it allows us to build or broaden repertoires, right? Like when we understand the function of any organism's repertoire, we're able to systematically arrange contingencies so as to broaden their repertoires and push for increased psychological flexibility.